Prigozhin, Prigozhin out. The coup that was quashed in a day, but the legacy of which could bring down the Russian Federation. In the 24-hour period between June 23rd and June 24th, the Russian mercenary group Wagner, which has been at the forefront of the battles in Ukraine over the last few months, effectively declared war on the Russian military, following months of tension between the Kremlin and the Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin, and a week away from the planned merger between the two under the Kremlin. Prigozhin, a close ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin until recently, led the Wagner Group forces from Ukraine into the Russian city of Rostov before traveling up the M4 motorway with the intentions of reaching Moscow and overthrowing Russia's military command. And with the world watching their advance on the capital, an agreement was reached between Prigozhin and Putin to stop the war, with no Wagner fighters facing any consequences, and the former hot dog seller being exiled to Belarus. Whilst the Russian status quo remains intact, it is significantly weaker than it was a few days ago, with such an act of dissent leaving at one point a very serious threat of deposition, further lowering the already damaged morale of the Russian army. Is this the beginning of the end for Putin? Why did Prigozhin, who seemed ready for blood, stand down and accept exile? Is there anyone who comes out of this brief mutiny looking good, other than Ukraine? What's next for Russia?
So let's get to it. Gentlemen, what's next for Russia? As always, we begin with our quick fire round, 30 seconds each to let your initial stance on the matter, and we pick up the conversation from there. Jeff Hawn, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Thank you. I believe the regime will attempt to recalibrate and refocus on the war going forward, but now the regime is permanently weakened. Elite infighting has been a staple of Russia's internal dynamics since 1993, and this is the first time it has really spilled into the open since the early 2000s, and it did so in a spectacular fashion where the formal institutions of state were successfully challenged by what in was effect a private militia. We could well see the Russian political dynamics beginning to return to the 1990s, where the country was rocked by a very violent confrontation between different political factions.
Mr. Elovskii, your thoughts?
Well, I think that this is actually the beginning of the end of Putinism. This episode showed us that Putin is no longer in charge of anything that goes on in the country, and especially in the war. And this is a big signal for Ukrainians. I mean, if Wagner and if Prigozhin with the bunch of his thugs, managed to almost reach Moscow. Why Ukrainians and their army cannot do it this way now?
Last but not least, Martin Himel, your take?
Well, there's that term, it's close, but it's not a cigar, meaning it's not just enough to hit the goalpost, you got to score. And Prigozhin did not score. He did not reach Moscow. He did not topple Vladimir Putin. So he failed, yet he did shake his regime, Putin's regime. The big question now, what will Putin do to hold his stake on power?
And on that note, gentlemen, let's please feel free to interact from this point onwards. And usually the hardest thing is to predict what's next, but this time around it seems the other way around. And in other words, gentlemen, what the H happened yesterday, Mr. Elovskii?
Well, this is a pretty interesting question, and it's very hard to assess right now because it's been so fast, and we see that actually the time as we used to treat it doesn't work anymore in Russia. And like the usual way of things developing, it doesn't work anymore. And Rostov-on-Don, actually, where the coup started, we see the video from the city right now. It's actually very powerful, and city is capital of Russian southern district. So there are many military people, many policemen, many guards, and it's very peculiar that the coup actually started from there. This city is actually next to Lugansk region, which is overtaken by Russian military these days. And actually, it's very important to understand the role of Lukashenko, why he was the person in charge of the negotiations, why he was appointed on that post by Putin. This is the big question that I actually cannot answer right now.
Mr. Hawn, we are getting a bit speculative here, but if we're looking at the bottom line, Putin, to an extent, and we'll obviously discuss his future shortly, seems like the lesser of two evils, considering Prigozhin set to take over Moscow in a matter of minutes yesterday. So from the West standpoint, I'm speaking. So is it possible that Prigozhin and Putin were in cahoots here?
No.
No.
What we saw here is what normally happens behind the scene. Prigozhin is a byproduct of the Russian political system that was set up under Boris Yeltsin and has continued and been solidified under Putin, which is to say that it is various political factions and oligarchs who fight one another for access, for control, for money, and Putin plays the role as supreme arbiter. It's basic paternal politics. Now, since the war began, the stakes have gone up massively. It's important to note, Prigozhin never called this a coup, and he only targeted the defense ministry, who has been his primary opposition within government, because obviously the defense ministry doesn't like being made to look like idiots by a bunch of essentially what are street thugs and former soldiers. He called this a march for justice. So in a way, it was very much an armed protest. And he didn't overthrow the regime, but one has to wonder if that was ever his goal, because he's walking away with it with his skin intact, probably his financial assets. And we have to remember that if Wagner had been brought under the Ministry of Defense's control last week, as was intended, there's a good chance that those within government who already have it out for him could have brought criminal charges on any number of issues. That's typically how this happens in Russia, is once you fall out of favor, you find yourself targeted by the prosecutor because you're definitely guilty of something if you're that high up in government.
And so, speaking to that point, Martin, Himel, what's next for Prigozhin? What's next for the Wagner mercenaries who followed him?
Well, I don't think Prigozhin's going to go into exile and pick roses and retire. I'm sure he's going to try and regroup in some way. And I don't put it past Vladimir Putin that he'll want Prigozhin to be one of those people that inexplicably commit suicide among oligarchs. Putin would definitely have him in the crosshairs. He's a big threat. So the next move is going to be quite interesting, but I don't think anybody could venture to guess what that would be. I think one other viewpoint to this is actually from a Western viewpoint. This is not a matter of some rogue Sudanese or a Niger or Rwandan or Central American general marching on a capital. We're talking about a country that has thousands of nuclear warheads that have big implication for everybody else in the world. And if this was to get out of hand, it is a coup and a struggle between two rival armies. Those nuclear weapons hang in the balance and are a big problem for all of us.
And are we purely speaking in past tense, Jeff Hawn? Will the events drive Putin perhaps to resort to extreme measures, both on the front lines and domestically?
Domestically, we're definitely probably going to be seeing a reshuffle among the elites. It's important to note that what happens to Wagner in the coming weeks is going to be very indicative of the line the regime is taking. If it continues to exist, it will continue to serve as a major embarrassment for the regime. It's more likely it will be broken up and folded into the regular military. What's important to note, though, is it's not the only independent militia in Russia right now. You have the Kadyrite militia from Chechnya, which actually was at the outskirts of Rostov-on-Don, ready to go into battle when the agreement was announced. You have units that are sponsored by individual regions and increasingly under control of their regional governors, because they're the ones who finance and supply them. And you have other PMCs that are led by lesser known figures. So future tense, domestically, it's going to be it's going to be a lot of tension, and it's only a matter of time before it breaks. In terms of foreign affairs, especially in regards to WMDs, that is the million-dollar question. But historically, even during the most unstable times of 91 and 94, 95, the military has maintained strict control over the nuclear weapons. So I'm not sure if that's as big of an issue as it's often made out to be.
Yes, and we'll obviously dive in deeper into the ramifications on the war in Ukraine. But Dmitrii Elovskii, staying in Russia, what is the current state of morale in the Russian army? And also, are we to see a potential civil uprising, or can Russia snap back from this chaos?
Well, you see, Russia is leading that so-called special military operation for almost a year and a half. And actually, it is a war, and people do understand it. It's understood by military commanders, by simple people, and by soldiers, and by officers, and by everybody. And it's pretty obvious that the military operation is not going in the right way. It should have been done much earlier, much earlier. But from the other hand, we can see that nobody from the regular army or from the police or from the National Guard has decided to join the militia, to join the Prigozhin on his march towards Moscow. Nobody, actually. And we are aware that there was a number of aircrafts that were destroyed by PMC Wagner through their march. As far as I remember, there were 6 helicopters and 1 big military airplane. So it goes around like half a dozen people murdered, killed by Prigozhin and by his thugs. And it's very important that Putin or any of Russian officials, or Peskov, who is the press secretary of Mr. Putin, they actually say nothing about those people, that victims of this coup. And it actually means quite a lot. Like 6 people died during these days. And they have families, they have kids, but nobody's paying attention to it.
Yeah, generally speaking, perhaps in hindsight, the way Russian media and Russian authorities handled the unfolding situation will be taught in schools, as we say. Martin Himel, before we take a break, bottom line, is Putin weaker or stronger?
I think he's slightly weaker. He's shown he's vulnerable. He's shown that he doesn't have a complete iron grip over the country, but I wouldn't count him out yet. He's a ferocious contender and fighter. Okay,
on that note, gentlemen, you're staying with us. We are taking a very short break, but when we get back, we discuss what is next for the Russia-Ukraine war, how it is all going to affect the Ukrainian counter-offensive and the West's actions vis-a-vis Russia. So do not go anywhere. Jeff Hawn, Dmitrii Elovskii, Martin Himel, you're staying with us, and so should you, dear viewers. 2 minutes, and we're back.
Zoom in each weekday here at I-24 News.
Strictly Security, your weekly look into security, intelligence, and strategic affairs. Our team brings the latest on the major international conflicts, analysis of the major security issues right here in the Middle East and around the globe. Saturdays, only on I-24 News.
We're on the inside of political and religious passions in Jerusalem, breaking down the financial trends shaping the global economy, giving you key context, not just headlines. With the stories from Israel that touch the U.S. and those across the region with impact far beyond its borders. Sunday to Thursday on I-24 News. Catch the rundown, where the Middle East meets the world.
Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Martin Himel, Dmitrii Elovskii, Jeff Hawn. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for staying with us. We're, of course, also staying on topic. But before we get back to our conversation, the view from Kyiv. How is it all affecting Ukraine's next moves? Let's take a listen to the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky.
Today is a day when there should definitely be no silence, and we definitely need leadership. Today, the world saw that the bosses of Russia do not control anything, nothing at all, complete chaos, complete absence of any predictability, and it is happening on Russian territory, which is fully loaded with weapons. I will say it in Russian. The man from the Kremlin is obviously very afraid and probably hiding somewhere, not showing himself. I am sure that he is no longer in Moscow. He calls somewhere and asks for something. He knows what he is afraid of because he himself created this threat. All evil, all losses, all hatred, it is himself who spreads it. And the longer he can run between his bunkers, the more you will all lose. Everyone who is connected with Russia.
Let's get to it, gentlemen. Another quick fire round, 30 seconds each. Is the Russia turmoil good or bad for the Ukrainian counteroffensive? Dmitrii, Elovskii, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Oh, it's actually great. It's not only good, it's very good news for Ukraine. Well, first of all, because they see that Russia is weak. Russia is much weaker than they used to think. And now they have some success on the front. Meanwhile, there is a attempt of coup in Russia. And secondly, actually, that's what I said in the beginning.
Yeah.
That means that they can invade Russia and they can go almost to Moscow. It's not a big problem now for them.
Martin Himel.
I think that it's good for Ukraine, but Ukraine has to be very sober about it. The Russian threat isn't over. And if they are too successful, if Ukraine is too successful, it might put Putin in a corner and could tempt him to use unorthodox weapons against them. Let's not forget, Russia is a superpower. It has lots of nuclear weapons. They might not use it so quickly, but if push comes to shove, Putin could get desperate.
Yeah, the nuclear gun still on the table. Last but not least, Jeff Hawn, your thoughts?
The turmoil is very positive for Ukraine. It further undermines faith in the Russian military, even among Russian servicemen. And it shows that armed protests can gain results with little consequence. We know that mutinies have been reported in the Russian army since the earliest days of the conflict. And this very open mutiny just will continue to erode the Russian military's cohesion as morale collapses. But it'll still be a hard fight for Ukraine, most definitely.
Okay, gentlemen, let's feel free to engage in a conversation from this point onwards. Martin Himel, is it all bringing the war closer to an end?
That remains to be seen. I still think Russia is a threat, and I still think Putin is holding on to power for now, and he'll take measures to try to keep that power. That remains to be seen. I think that if Ukraine was on the verge of a victory, I think it would be pushing through the Russian lines pretty aggressively right now. But obviously, it can't do it yet. It has a healthy respect for the Russian military. And so I think it's a chip into the Russian armor. It's shaken Russia to a certain degree. It's given Ukraine a bit of an edge. But I don't think everybody's going to say that this is checkmate and the end of the war.
Dmitrii, Elovskii.
Well, yes, I do agree. This is good news, actually, but it doesn't mean that Russia can be overtaken, can be conquered, and Putin can lose the war within next weeks or next month. And we actually have to keep an eye on the Ukrainian counter-offensive attack, and it's still quite important. Though I think that the signs of Putin being not that tough guy as everybody used to think about him, it's very extremely positive. And I actually think that now Ukrainians might have something to talk about with Mr. Prigozhin, and maybe there could be some sort of negotiations with him. Though, yeah, keep in mind that he's definitely a criminal, war criminal.
But Jeff Hawn, the enemy of your enemy is not always your friend.
I think if Ukraine ever gets their hands on Prigozhin or gets in a position where they can get their hands on Prigozhin, the only thing they'll do with him is throw him in a war crimes tribunal. He's behind some of the most brutal atrocities of the conflict. But what's interesting is he has the perception of being one of the most effective. Certainly the Wagnerites their actual effectiveness is highly debatable in military analyst circles, but their propaganda was very good, saying that the Kadyrovites. The fact that they're now being folded in the MOD, where there's a lot of discontent, especially with the top brass and the senior officers, you really have to wonder, is this conflict going to end the way many conflicts in Russia's history have ended with widespread mutiny, with widespread disaffection among soldiers, not just 1917, but wars against the Ottomans, wars against the Poles. Many of them essentially fell apart because of widespread discontent in the military. At a certain point, Russian soldiers start to decide that the enemy's not in front of them, it's behind them.
Yeah, it's always the enemy from within. Martin, yeah.
Yes, there's a wild card here that we should consider, and no one can pretend to say that they know this is going to happen or not. But if Prigozhin were to become more popular, if he were to somehow take power in Russia, I think that would be a big disaster for the Russians and the Ukrainians. He makes Putin look like a moderate. I mean, he is a ruthless war criminal, and I don't think he'd go soft on Ukraine. I think he'd use everything possible to defeat them, and he would crack down very hard on his own people. So I think the fact that Prigozhin hasn't won yet is maybe good for everybody, but he's not out of the game yet.
And hence my earlier suggestion, it was perhaps a good cop, bad cop of Putin Prigozhin here, but I was overruled by our panelists. We are nearing the end of our discussion, gentlemen, and again, hindsight is challenging, but predictions not less so. What is the next turning point? What are we to see next, Dmitrii Elovskii?
Well, I definitely think that there would be another attempt of coup in the nearest future, and this is first thing. Secondly, we have to take a close look on events in Belarus. I actually don't know why Lukashenko decided to take Prigozhin, and I think that the romance that we've been witnessing between Putin and Lukashenko, it's not that simple as we think about it, definitely. But on the other hand, what we get at the end of this weekend is actually that Prigozhin is no longer in Russia, and BMC Wagner doesn't exist anymore. And we know that, as my colleagues has already mentioned, they were pretty efficient during the war. So let's see how Putin will lead his war in Ukraine without Prigozhin and without BMC Wagner.
Jeff Hawn, final, wrap it up for us.
I've always said that Putin will only leave office feet first. It's just a question of when, but the reaper waits for no man. And he will go eventually. And when he does, we've gotten a glimpse of what the power struggle over his succession will look like. And it does not look good.
Yeah, it doesn't look good. Martin Himel, final remarks?
I think the unexpected is what we should expect. Putin will do something to try to shore up his power. The question is what it will be. We don't know. Prigozhin, if he remains alive, will do something to come back. And Ukraine, if it wants to make its point, it has to go on, and if it can, has to go on a very serious counteroffensive soon.